Hey there. How do you feel as an English language learner when someone corrects you? Do you welcome their help or do you feel overwhelmed? If you're struggling just to understand and maybe respond back to them, then that might be all your brain can manage at that point. And if they try to correct you, your brain might rebel. We'll talk about this. As a young, inexperienced language teacher, I taught French the way the foreign language classes I took at university guided me to do. When I got to my first school, I received grammar and vocabulary textbooks, and I taught grammar and vocabulary. And I thought my job was to correct any mistakes, which is what I did. If my students said something wrong or incorrectly or wrote something incorrectly, I thought, what's wrong with that student? I've already said that, explained that. They've seen that word, they've heard that word. They must not be paying attention. That was my conclusion. I'm sure I frustrated lots of students. But about 10 years into teaching French, I heard about a different way to acquire and to teach languages. Up to that point, I didn't know anything about the science behind how our brains acquire a language. They never talked about that in my education classes at college. No. But thanks be to God, and good for my students, they were blessed. When I made the change, I found out about the science behind language acquisition. I found out how the brain works, and I changed the way I taught French. I gave my students lots of rich input. I told stories that I drew pictures on the board to illustrate, or I had actors to act out, or I used lots of facial gestures, changed my voice, and if they still didn't understand something, I just simply wrote the meaning in their native language, which was English. The point was for them to understand. Eventually, language came out, but they had to understand and hear a lot. I didn't correct them. I focused on their understanding, their comprehension. But then something else happened that completely changed what I knew about teaching and learning languages. I finally started to work on another language myself. It'll be 5 years in June. I started working on Spanish the same way as I was teaching French, through input, input, input. And I remember that about 1 year into this process of watching YouTube videos, listening to podcasts, I paid for a Colombian gal online through Skype to give me Spanish conversation classes. Well, everything I said, she would either correct my pronunciation or correct the verbs or the structure of the language. And what I found out is that my brain rebelled. I had no mental space to absorb what she said. My brain felt too full. It was just all I could do to understand and to try to speak. After about 2 sessions, I wrote her an email and said, I can't do it this way. It's too much for my brain. I'm not ready for any corrections. Could you just tell me stories and in simple Spanish and help me understand what they mean so I can just be filled with content, with input, so I can hear the language, just focus on understanding. She couldn't make that switch. She was not a teacher, but that probably didn't make a difference. She just was a native Spanish speaker, and she had offered herself online as a conversational tutor in Spanish. So that was 1 year into learning Spanish. Another 1.5 years passed, and I still did not want anybody to correct me. It did me no good. That's what I would tell them. Well, I probably didn't tell them that. I wasn't paying them. I just didn't pay attention because I couldn't absorb. I didn't have any mental space in my brain. I could feel that. It felt overwhelming. But one day, it was different. And I didn't make the change. My brain did. I was talking online with a local Hispanic friend, my friend Terry, and I think she might have corrected me. And all of a sudden, I was interested. Like, oh, what did you just say? Tell me that again. Let me write this down. It's like all of a sudden, my brain had set up a network, had gotten a structure of the language, had enough language that I understood and knew how to say. And now there were empty spots where I could receive some corrections. It didn't feel overwhelming. That was that was such a surprising change. I didn't do anything. It was my brain who directed the process. Which, not who. And now I want correction. But the question is, do I want to be corrected on everything? And the answer is no. On expressions, vocabulary, verbs that I know already, like I know what they mean and I can say them incorrectly, I do want that kind of correction. But I already know what they mean. I've heard them enough. I've read them enough. But when I encounter something new, I don't even write it down because it won't do me any good. It's only what I already know and what my body feels, my brain feels it is ready to make more accurate. Isn't that interesting? I never knew that. I am so sorry for how I made my students feel. I probably made them feel stupid. Like, Mrs. Cochran thinks I'm lazy, like I'm not trying hard. And I know they were, because I now know what it feels like when you're acquiring another language. I know how much repetition I need to have. So, dear friends, if your brain feels too full for a correction, there's nothing wrong with you. Just either ignore the correction, or if it's somebody you're working with, just tell them gently, I'm not ready for that yet. It's a process, and we don't direct it. Our brain directs it, just like with little kids. So don't feel bad about yourself. It is okay. Just get a lot of input. And I'm talking about, like, every day, some input. Whether you watch videos, whether you listen to podcasts, or whether you read, or whether you're around people who speak English and you're trying to follow the conversation, get some input, because it's only through input that you understand, that your understanding and your final being able to speak English will come about. Well, tell me about your experience with corrections. Do they help or do they hurt? Well, I'm Maria from English Without Fear. Talk to you next time. Thanks for watching. For questions or comments, here is my email